My name is Ricky Kilpatrick. I'm area forestry agent with LSU AgCenter in this little corner of the Western Gulf, this 9-parish area in northwest Louisiana. And I'm going to look at a kind of a totally different approach. What I am going to look at is going to complement a lot of what Mary Ann talked about and show kind of how some of these problems manifest themselves in the real world with tree problems. We're going to talk about, I know that the topic is abiotic factors, but like Don Bragg said this morning, sometimes it's kind of hard to look at these things in isolation in the real world because there's so much interaction between abiotic and biotic factors. And I'm an old rock and roller, so I'm going to refer to abiotic factors as earth, wind, and fire. And the biotic, I think, we'll call heart. So get a little bit of rock and roll in there. And just like those factors are hard to look at in isolation, a lot of cases, urban versus rural settings is hard to look in isolation. Somebody mentioned earlier today that, you know, the disease or insect or whatever factors don't draw the line when they get to the city limits. So a lot of these things are overlapping, and you'll look at some of my things that I'm going to discuss and say, well, that's certainly not abiotic factors, but there's a connection to an abiotic factor in most cases. What I've done over the years for, I don't know, maybe the past 20 years is kind of kept a list of, in the light of David Letterman, maybe the top 10 most common problems that I see in this area, Shreveport-Bossier area primarily, but some of the outlying areas too, that homeowners or communities or neighborhood groups or Shreveport Green or someone like that calls me with a problem, and I kind of informally in the back of my mind keep a tally of what's going on. And so that's what we're going to do is kind of look at a top 10 list and connect those. And like I said, it'll kind of manifest some of the things that Mary Ann talked about, a lot to do with root structure and drought and temperature and things like that. So with that, we'll hit the road here. Now, I couldn't just keep it to 10, so I've got a couple of honorable mentions too. This first one here, construction damage and landscaping. And keep in mind, this is a list that I kind of keep as far as the most common calls, the most common problems I get in this region of the Western Gulf here. Construction damage, landscaping, very common problem, very much connected to root and oxygen intake and root development and that kind of thing. But how many people that call me after they've built a home and 4 years later their beautiful oak tree in front of their house died, that the main reason they built the house there, and of course they killed it when they built the house and put that layer of soil on top of the roots and suffocated those roots slowly over 4 or 5 years. Every time a new development goes in, I'll get calls for the next several years about trees dying in that area. And there's some more of that related to new developments too that we'll come back to in just a little while, but construction and landscaping and that kind of thing. I try to get people to plan ahead on their landscaping before they build that house and do all of that dirt work and think about ways that they can protect the root zone of their tree and give it a fighting chance. You know, Mary Ann mentioned that trees adapt and do what they need in a lot of cases to survive, but we do need to give them a fighting chance and don't just sink them with not much hope to come out of some of these situations. You can see here's a little abiotic-biotic overlap here where a tree has had pine tree has had a lot of dirt work done around the bottom. And of course, the first thing you always tell is, and Paul mentioned this in his discussion about seeing that root flare at the bottom of the tree when you go to a site and it's just a cylinder going into the ground. You know that there's been a lot of soil added around that tree, and of course that weakening of the tree led to turpentine beetles that eventually led to Ips beetles that eventually killed that tree there. Graft compatibility, and I put years on a couple of these things just to help me remember. This really showed up strong in the Shreveport-Bossier area in about 2007 and 8, and it showed up strong in Bradford pears and other flowering pears. Not that these grafts were totally incompatible. Now this is a maple But just to show you the graft line on this little tree, the graft wasn't completely incompatible, but when we looked at some of these trees after they died and you pull them up, they didn't have a very much of a root, not near enough root to support this size tree. Real common with all the grafted flowering pears and Bradford pears. There's a movie place here in Shreveport that has a lot of these flowering pears planted around the perimeter of the parking lot, probably 80 or 100 trees around this parking lot and this whole facility. And in these couple of years, I don't know, the first 2 years, maybe 6 or 8 or 10 a year died, and then it kind of slowed down a little bit. And my guess is that, I don't know, maybe 40 years ago when Bradford pears and flowering pears really became a popular landscape tree and a lot of people started planting them around here. And maybe a lot of these trees were getting to that age, if they had this root graft problem, that it was finally catching up with them. They can live on a smaller root for a while, but eventually it's going to finally catch up with them. And I think we just hit a period of time when a lot of these trees were the same age, and they all started, or a lot of them started dying. And every year since then we've had a little bit more of it, but it seemed like that particular period it was a lot of it. Tree, a lot of times they'll turn just beautiful fall colors in July, and then that's the end of it. Wounds and decay. This is kind of something that's off the normal beaten path, but I, of course, get calls all the time about trees with wounds and decay. Is this tree too high of a risk to leave on the place, or should I take it down? And of course, we look at a couple of things: where the tree is located, and the threat as far as the location of the tree, and then use that ISA kind of rule of thumb. If the wound is more than 30% of the circumference of that tree at that height, or if it's a cavity that's taking up more than 30% of the circumference, that is probably a high enough risk to take that tree on down. And these situations, a lot of times, this was one that just was called on in Shreveport, where half of a tree broke off, and they had called me and they were going to cut it down, but then somebody in the neighborhood called and talked about the historical value of that tree and that kind of thing. So you have to deal with that kind of thing, but eventually you've got to look out for safety and liability and that kind of thing. And this is on public property. And actually, this tree, between a third and a half of it had broken off, and the fork right there that's left has got a split it's coming on down eventually, pretty soon if they don't take it down. But actually, that live oak on the right over there had a bad problem too. They weren't even calling me about that, but half of its crown was dead on the outside of that tree. And if they remove the dead material, that's a real one-sided tree too. So they were calling me about should they remove one tree, and I told them they need to remove them both. This was a tree that resulted in a lawsuit because the adjacent homeowner would come home and lots of days limbs would fall on their car and that kind of thing. And so they called the person who owned the lot with the tree and sent them a certified letter and said this tree is really, really a problem. And then the next thing you know, the tree fell over on the neighbor's house and car and caused a lot of damage. So again, that 30% rule of thumb is a good thing there to do. And trees are nice, but they're not worth the liability of something like that. Improper pruning. There were several things that Mary Ann talked about that I thought of that relate to leaf area, and only removing 25% and that kind of thing. And I made a couple of notes, but one thing that you mentioned, Mary Ann, a tree, when we have extremes like drought and heat and that kind of thing, and you mentioned that these trees will drop needles or drop leaves to account for dry conditions so that they're not transpiring as much and not losing as much moisture. As long as it's got enough leaf area and branches on the tree to do that. Now, if it's got leaves there, it can drop them, but if it doesn't have leaves there, it can't drop them. That tree doesn't have much of an option to drop many leaves the next year when it comes out, because it's going to have such a limited amount of leaves when it comes out. This happens in a lot of cases, and I don't want you to always think about it's the arborist's fault either. I can't tell you how many times I've went out to a place and the arborist has actually visited with the homeowner and talked to him about the proper way to prune a tree, and the homeowner said, I don't care, I don't want any leaves over, any branches whatsoever over my house. And like Paul mentioned in his discussion, this always comes after a storm. You know, they call you after the storm and you think, well, if the tree made it through that storm, you ought to feel a little bit better about it. But we're going to come and prune the heck out of it now and give it a crew cut and no limbs over the house. So I feel a lot better about my tree, and that's a pretty tree there with all that weak sucker sprout growth coming back on the stubs of the crew cut that the tree got. I think I'd take the tree down if I was going to do that. Looked at a tree a couple of years ago over in Arcadia. This was a beautiful shoemart oak that had been crew cut about 4 years prior to this, and this is what it looked like now. And every one of those branch stubs there were decaying and rotting and had those weak sucker sprouts growing off from them. And they asked me what could they do now, and I said there's not a lot you can do for that tree. There's not really salvaging to make much out of that tree anymore. Some other things that happen because of improper pruning, there are certain trees that just don't like to be pruned. Magnolias, American beech, Leland cypress. This is a Leland cypress that had originally been planted as a brake. Just there was something behind this house that they didn't want to look at, so they planted them as a brake. And then they came back later and decided to raise the crown of them and take the lower limbs off of them. They pruned them real, real hard, wrong time of the year. And these trees Leland cypress got covered with bagworms. And you can just see the bagworms all over the ground there. And they ended up dying from the bagworm infestation due to the heavy pruning, wrong time of the year, on a tree that doesn't like to be pruned a whole lot. Now here's something interesting too. We learn a lot from nature, I think, and I told you, magnolia is a tree that doesn't like to be pruned a lot, and maybe it doesn't like to be pruned a lot because our magnolias, they like and Paul said this too. Most of our trees really like a soil with good internal drainage. They don't like to be sitting in a bowl of water, and magnolias are definitely one that like a sandy creek bottom type soil, a soil that has good internal drainage and real sensitive to soil compaction. And so maybe the reason they don't like to be pruned so much is so that those lower limbs kind of protect their root zone, the duff layer from those magnolia leaves falling off, but there's nobody walking under there with a lawnmower or riding under it with a riding mower as opposed to this one here. So maybe it's a way to protect its own root zone. This is at a house called the Huey P. Long House here in Shreveport. And these two trees are in the same yard. And that picture really doesn't do it justice. But the one on the left is the one that had all the lower limbs pruned up, and the one on the right is the one that's left the limbs. Now, those trees were planted at the same time, and if you could see them in real life, the one on the right is much, much healthier and looks much better than the one on the left. And again, it's protected its root zone. And again, another one of those things that had to think about the species and the type of tree that we're pruning. Wildlife damage. I guess this one falls completely under the heart category instead of earth, wind, and fire. But you can't see the coloration in these on the screen here near as good as you can on this computer screen, but this is squirrel damage in a live oak. And I guess you could say that's related to drought too. When that squirrel doesn't want to come down from the tree to get his drink of water, he just gnaws on the edge of a branch, or on the girdle of a branch to get his moisture out of it, and then the outer 3 feet of that tree dies where he's girdled it because he's too lazy to come down and get his drink of water. And you'll see this a lot of these communities where there's a lot of squirrels in there and a lot of squirrel nests, and then you'll see trees that look like this. And it shows up a little bit better on this tree here. And And that's actually a pecan tree. But again, squirrel damage. On some a young silver maple where they're using that bark that strips off really well to build their squirrel nest. And then, maybe it doesn't kill the tree, but it's one of those situations like a lot of these other problems. Do you want to keep investing your time and years for that tree to continue to grow that's already got starting out kind of behind the eight ball with a lot of problems? I guess so, if you get rid of the squirrels. They make deterrents and things like that for squirrels and sapsuckers and all, but I always figure whatever you do, they'll just move on up the trunk a little bit higher and do it. So and really that's a problem. When I was a kid, there were a lot more people that squirrel hunted, and squirrel populations weren't so bad that. Yeah, you can't shoot them in town. That's right. You can't shoot them. You can trap them, and that's almost to no avail. I have a brother-in-law that caught 50 in a have-a-heart trap one year and hauled them out somewhere and let them out, but you couldn't tell it. A year later, you couldn't tell it. Right. And so it really is a problem, and it's one of those things, like I said, in this part of the country, when I was a teenager, there weren't many deer, not many deer at all. Now, there's a lot more deer now, and it has to do with good forestry and wildlife management practices over the years. But because there weren't many deer around, people that hunted, a lot more of us squirrel hunted because at least you saw something that you could shoot. And there weren't near as many squirrel problems in town because there weren't near as many squirrels around. Not many people squirrel hunt now. The squirrels move in and out of town from rural areas, and they're just a ton more squirrels now. A little bit like the feral hog problem has become. There are some deterrents and things like that are listed, and in the Extension Service of Wildlife, U.S., well, it's kind of a combination of wildlife specialists working together that put together. Yeah. Yeah. There's physical things, and then there are, depending on what the problem is, sometimes there's things like mothballs or other kind of chemical things that you can use that may deter or whatever. Now, what specifically, I'd have to look and see. But what I was going to tell you is the Extension Service has got a really good wildlife nuisance control manual, and it lists deterrents and things like that you can use for several different things like this. And I'd have to look specifically to see what they recommend as far as like whether it's physical noise makers or something that moves. But you know how it is. A lot of these things may work for a couple of weeks, and then they get smart and figure out it's not going to hurt them, and then so it's a lot of times it's kind of an integrated approach that you have to use, more than one thing over time. This is the old yellow-bellied sapsucker that, most homeowners call with see these holes and they think it's some kind of borer in their tree. But I've seen them do lots of damage, and these are some young live oaks where they did so many hole peckings in the trunk of the tree that they kind of did the connect the dots thing, and whole chunks of bark fall off. And again, maybe it doesn't kill the tree, but do you want to invest 30 or 40 years in a young tree that's going to have these wounds and problems from then on? And I've got a few insects in here with wildlife damage. Probably not the place to put them, but it's a way for me to get more problems in fewer slides in my 1 through 10. So this is a flagging from cicadas that you have to some degree every year. Some of these cicadas that we call 17-year cicadas, but you see them a lot more than once every 17 years. And then the old twig girdler, if you've seen these in pecan trees where it looks like a sharpened pencil where the branch fell off, and that insect lays his egg on the outer part of the limb that he's cutting off so that his eggs can hatch in the part that falls on the ground. So if you want to get rid of next year's generation, gather those limbs up and burn them just as soon as you find them. Last year we had a lot of oak defoliator insects in the early spring, and I got a lot of calls in this area and a little bit south of Shreveport with various oak defoliators, caterpillars, and things that defoliate the leaves on oak trees. And of course, the folks don't a lot of times they don't see the insect, the culprit that did the damage. They just see my tree had leaves on it last week, and this week it's bare. And of course, it's early enough in the year that normally they put on back out all right. But anything like this that weakens or stresses that tree down, like, makes it more susceptible to other problems. And this was a bad problem last year, a little bit this year, but not as bad as last year. This is one of the biggest ones in this Shreveport-Bossier area, in our little area, and I'm sure you run into it in all other areas too. Species and site selection. Predominantly our soils around here are for the most part acidic, slightly acidic to pretty acidic soils. Good pine tree growing ground, a lot of oak trees, a lot of diversity of species on that type of soil. But along the Red River alluvial plain here is a high pH soil. It's completely different from what's just 10 miles away from the river. And a lot of people, a lot of developments along up and down the Red River on both sides of the river, up and down Highway 1 here on this side of the river, and up and down the river on the Bossier side. This high pH alluvial soil, not good for pine trees, not good for most oak trees, not good for a lot of other things that you see just a little bit further over in Houghton or over here in Greenwood or actually in the west side of Shreveport. And it's amazing how many developments have went in, and our landscape folks come in and plant things that are certainly not suitable to that soil. And I'll show you some examples of that in a minute. This is some yellowing pines in some of that soil that were planted. You know, pine trees grow fast. Let's plant some pine trees and get some trees on this ground that used to be just pecan trees for landscaping purposes. And sure enough, they end up yellow and unhealthy, and if they live, they're unhealthy. A southern red oak planted that I watched die for about 5 years, and they finally took it out because it was still alive, but just barely alive. Shumard and willow oak. And even though Shumard is listed as one maybe a little bit more tolerable of high pH, and it's not a good one either for this Red River alluvial soil, there are several subdivisions just north of Bossier City, between Bossier City and Benton, in this soil. And nearly every one of them, the developers came in there as they built these houses and planted a bunch of willow oaks. And of course, they planted them with the spade truck, so they looked fine for 2 or 3 or 4 years living in that soil that they were planted with. But once those roots got out into that native soil, they started turning yellow and dying. And you can ride through several communities or subdivisions up in that area, and you'll see these dead and dying willow oaks. People call me and ask me about soil amendments or something to do to lower the pH, and maybe you can do a little bit, but I try to tell them it's a lot easier to plant the right tree than to work with the soil. This calcium carbonate in this soil that makes this high pH, you can add sulfur to it, and maybe you can bring it down a little bit, but 1 year later it's back up to where it was. Put together a little fact sheet. I get so many calls on this, I refer people to this fact sheet a lot of the time now and just send that to them. Don't plant this. Here's some things that you can plant. The old green ash used to be on that suitable list, but we've taken it off because I hate to plant something that's not going to be there in 5 or 6 years. So, and I know a lot of people aren't big fans of ash trees, but what was that? Was that a mouse? He's looking for a tree to chew on because he hears me talking up here. That's pretty weird. But anyway, I was a pretty big fan of green ash and white ash trees. They're not such a big fan of the Berlandia and Arizona ash, but the native ashes that we had around here, good landscape trees, could grow on a wide range of sites that a lot of times were hard for other species. And just a great tree, and I hate that we're losing that tree. Insect galls, just another one I threw in there. This was a problem I got a lot of calls on and saw a lot of, I don't know, about 10 years ago for a couple of years in a row. And don't ask me what the situation was with the weather or whatever, but a lot of insect gall problems. Maybe just a explosion in the population of the gall wasp that do this or something like that but for 2 or 3 years. And of course, these things, once they're on the tree, they're there until the branches fall off or whatever, but it seemed to be just a really high occurrence of them a couple of years in a row, 10 or 12 years ago. Native pine bark beetles and other related problems. I kind of lumped a bunch of things in here together. You know, I started this job in 1985, and we had the worst southern pine beetle epidemic we ever had in this region in 86, 87, right through there. And so we had a lot of problems with that. And we've had some occurrences since then, nothing to that degree with southern pine beetle. Most everything I've seen around here for the last at least 6 or 8 years has been Ips beetle problems, and closely correlated with the droughts that we've had and that kind of thing. And that still runs around. But a couple of years ago, we had a lot of other things going on up here, and losing a lot of pine trees in this area. And it was a combination of things. I called Wood Johnson, and he came up here, and he and I and another forester spent a lot of time looking around at a lot of these. Some of it I felt was pitch canker, maybe a little bit of, I know, some root rot, some red heart, and then a combination. And again, just like it's hard to look at abiotic and biotic factors in isolation, it's hard to look at some of these problems, even though they're maybe all biotic factors, in isolation, that one led to another and the stress of one problem led to another and that kind of thing. Pitch canker in some areas. These slides are so dark it's hard to see them. This is from a paper that Dale Starkey and some other guys worked on a few years ago, showing occurrence of pitch canker, and it was pretty high in certain years. And they found out some of the things that were interesting in here, that they seemed to be bad around poultry houses out in rural areas, and then they connected that maybe to high nitrogen levels. Well, one of the problems when I got Wood to come up here and we looked at these pine trees all over this area that were dying from a variety of problems and combination of problems. This was on a golf course up north of Shreveport. And a lot of trees were dying on this golf course. Some of them had pitch tubes from Ips beetle. Some of them had no pitch tubes. You look at the tree on the left. That's right, I need to use this thing, don't I? These are the two trees, tree A and tree B. So this side here is tree A, and you see there were no pitch tubes, a lot of sapsucker holes, and there was a fruiting body at the base that I believe was a nosum root rot probably. The tree on the right, which is this trunk, was full of pitch tubes, no sapsucker holes, and there was what looked like a red heart conch up on the trunk of the tree 20 or 30 feet up. So there was a combination of problems. And if you looked at these two trees, and if you've ever noticed, you notice how when pine beetles or Ips beetles or beetles kill a tree, the needles stay tufted out, the foxtail type appearance, as opposed to pitch canker or some of these diseases that kill pine trees where the foliage looks more like wet hair hanging down instead of tufted out. And I noticed that I had that wet hair appearance in one of these trees, and actually in this tree. And there's a tree C, no problems, green. When I first took this picture on October the 21st, this is tree C, the little bit of it here, looked perfect. No pitch tubes, no holes, no anything. The tree was green. Now that I couldn't, of course, see up in the trunk of the tree, but I took this picture on October the 21st, and then 3 weeks later, I went back and all three trees were dead. Now, you can't see it a whole lot in here, but this tree was strictly Ips beetles, I believe, that moved over from these trees that had other problems that led to Ips beetles, because this one was completely tufted out, didn't look like these other two trees had looked. Of course, you see there's a dead tree over here that was dead from the whole start of the thing. But it was probably 30 pine trees that died on that golf course in that 1 year. And just a combination of things. And I kind of feel like this was in 2014. Our drought, keep talking about our 2011-10 drought. Well, in this area right here, 2010 through 2012 was really, really bad. And 10, the drought, late summer drought started. Well, we usually get a little bit of replenishment in the winter, but the winter of 2010-11 was real dry too. So our 2011 drought, we were already starting out in a deficit. So about 2.5 years in a row, really bad. This was in 2014, and like one of our speakers mentioned earlier, the lingering of these drought effects, even much later, I think had an impact on these trees. And we've mentioned this a time or two today, that we still have trees dying from 2010 and 11 drought from prolonged problems, or maybe something like this has come in secondary that's just taken that long for it to spiral down and eventually kill the tree. Yard care. Here's a good one that I guess you could call it a biotic factor from the fact that it's homeowners doing this most of the time. But the typical thing that we always run across is the weed eaters and the mowers and that kind of thing. Too much water, like we mentioned a while ago, most of these trees like good internal drainage in their soils, so water that'll pass on through and we're not in a bowl of water. So many times where we have a crepe myrtles or dogwoods or maple trees in a flower bed, and the homeowners watering their flowers and doing just right for that top 3 or 4 inches, but keeping it soaking wet, saturated down 10 or 12 inches and drowning their roots. And it's typical on a lot of these trees to see these lichens pop up on the trunk of the tree real bad. And try to tell the homeowners the lichens aren't the problem, it's the root aeration. And that's just a symptom of it. When they built I-49 through here years ago, it served kind of like a dam in some areas and raising the water table a little bit on the west side of the interstate. And you could drive down I-49 a few months later and you'd see a lot of these big oak trees and other hardwoods through there, but mainly the oaks, they looked fuzzy from the interstate because they were covered with these lichens. And of course they started dying from lack of soil aeration. And here's too much water on a dogwood tree in a flower bed, getting that dark brown curled leaf appearance. Herbicide damage, I kind of, again, took the liberty of lumping some things that maybe wouldn't fall under the category of yard care, but I guess herbicide damage would. But just to get a few more problems in on 1 through 10 here. But most of the time we think we're fairly safe with Roundup spraying on grass and weeds under a tree, but something that's got thin bark like a crepe myrtle can absorb it through the bark, and it can certainly do some damage to those too. And I don't have a picture of this, but I have a live oak in front of my house that not even sprayed, but when the tree trimming people were out one day doing some trimming work on a hot summer day, late hot summer day. They weren't spraying anything, but they had their truck with a 2,4-D chemical in it parked under my live oak, and just the volatilization of that 2,4-D under that almost killed the live oak. It killed a lot of the lower branches on it. It did come back, but they never sprayed anything, but they still did some chemical damage. And this is another one. This is the one I meant that I kind of took liberty sticking in here for yard care, but a lot of, red maple is a tree that I like to recommend a lot of. A good tree for a yard tree, real diverse in the type of soils that it'll grow in. But one problem, that thin bark tree, and other trees have the problem too. It's real susceptible to this bark splitting due to sun scald on winter days when it's cold temperatures and there's a lot of bright sunlight. You'll see these things split. And if you look, a lot of times it's on the south or the west or the southwest side of that tree from that sun shining on that thin bark trunk on a cold day in the winter. And that's just another picture of it. Flower beds around the tree base. You know, a lot of trees can tolerate a little bit of a flower bed if it's good porous soil and that kind of thing. But what a problem like this one is, somebody did this flower bed early on this tree, and the tree survived it, and that was fine. But now they want to get rid of that mound around the base of the tree, which is full of roots. And I've told them, you know, if you're going to do it in the winter, and don't do it all in one winter. Gradually do it, and maybe you'll be able to do it, but take it out without damaging too many roots. But that's a risk that they're going to have to take out that flower bed and not kill the tree. Foliar diseases. In our area here, about 3 springs in a row, we've had a lot of cool, moist, early springs when these trees are leafing out, and so we end up with a lot of anthracnose and leaf blister and fire blight, fungal and bacterial diseases that are well promoted at the right temperature range when that tree is leafing out, and a lot of moisture in the air. I put bacterial leaf scorch in here too. This is one that really popped up about 6 or 8 years ago. A lot of occurrence of it, and I think it's been misdiagnosed a lot in the past, or in beyond years before 6 or 8 years ago. But it's real common in pecan trees, and we've got a pecan research station here in Shreveport, so we have the means to test for this and other trees too. Sometimes a tree killer, as bad as this little live oak on the right looked, it did come back, and I thought it was a goner for sure, but that's another problem that we see a good bit. There it is in a red oak. Hypoxylin canker. This is probably the longest, worst one that I've seen as far as relating to drought and heat and that kind of thing. We've had in previous droughts, and prior to this bad one that we keep talking about in 2010-11, I've seen a lot of hypoxylin canker. But this particular drought, it was the worst I've seen in my 33 years of working as far as trees dying and of a specific problem. And I mean forested areas, places that you know, lose a tree or two here or there. Places that I used to go hunting that I don't go hunting anymore because there's so. I would say one area down in DeSoto Parish that I can think of that probably 60 or 70% of the mature oak trees out in the forest died from this, and now they're all laid over, and you can't hardly walk through there. This is in a front yard of a heavily treed front yard, but you see how many dead trees there are out there from hypoxylin, from the stress of the drought from 2010, 11, and 12. And another thing, you know, we think about the lack of water, the drought part of the problem, but the heat, the temperature is an issue too. And I don't necessarily have research to back this up, but I think about the waxy coated evergreens like this little magnolia tree. When we have several days in a row above 100-degree temperatures, and knowing that those leaves, like Marianne said a while ago, at a certain temperature, maybe 93 or so Fahrenheit, where they, at least on the pine, they close those stomata to try to conserve water and not transpire as much. And we've already got a waxy coated leaf that's maybe not losing or is retaining more moisture than some other tree. And you have several days in a row of above 100-degree temperatures that maybe it's cooking those leaves with more moisture in them, being a problem than if it didn't have as much moisture in it. This little magnolia is actually in my backyard, and it looked terrible after the summer. We had a summer that we had several days over 100 degrees in a row, and it wasn't necessarily one of the bad drought summers. It was just a bad temperature summer. But this tree looked like it wouldn't make it. It did come on out. Since then, we've had another summer like that. I've got another larger magnolia in the the front yard. Of course, the south and the west side was the bad side, and it took a hard hit to it. And I'm convinced that more moisture in a leaf when you've got a high temperature might be a problem for those trees too. Now the last two here are very, very specific, and I'm just basing this, like I said, on the number of calls I get and the problems I see around town. And this one is the crepe myrtle bark scale. Y'all know the history about the crepe myrtle bark scale, and let's see, one of our speakers this morning was talking about the gateway for importing and exporting, also being the gateway of our pests coming in. And of course, this is one that we believe came from somewhere over to Asia, and ended up in the Dallas area. And 6 or 8 years ago, it ended up here in Shreveport, Bossier area, and it's all over this area right now. You can't go far without seeing infested crepe myrtles and crepe myrtle bark scale. And, so I get calls about that every week. And not only the scale itself, but the sooty mold associated with the scale. And, of course, our researchers are doing research on this as far as more control with predators and things like that, to not have to depend so much on these neonicotinoid insecticides that will work on it, but also are not real good for our pollinators and things like that. This is a picture of infested tree on the bottom and a non-infested tree on the top, just showing what it does to flower production too on crepe myrtles. Got a fact sheet on that too, because the things that get a lot of calls on, we put a fact sheet on so we can refer people to that. And this is one that showed up the first year of our bad floodings in this area. You know, we've had all kinds of flooding in this area and different kinds of flood. In June of 2015, the Red River flooded its banks. So we had a lot of flooding from the river overflowing. And then in March of 2016, we had a flash flood type flooding, just massive water in low places from flash flooding. And then August of 2016 is when the bad flooding down in Baton Rouge that people are still trying to recover from down there. So we've had 3 different major flooding events, but they've been different kinds of floods. And after the first flood, in June of 2016 is when we started having this major blight problem with Leland cypress. And I say Leland cypress, other conifers too, eastern red cedar and some other things that are in our area that have these same blights. But it's a couple of different blights actually shown up too, Cercospora and a Phoma, something in the Phoma genus that really worked hard on these trees. And of course, everybody immediately, I say everybody, the TV station and the newspaper first totally attributed it to the flooding, but it actually occurred after, and I think it was related to the flood and rain, but I know plenty of places on high, dry, well-drained sites that the flooding, that the Leland cypress had the blight too, so it's not just strictly the flooding. This is something that propagates and continues on really, really bad in hot, humid weather. And I think the hot, humid weather after the flooding was more detrimental than just our typical hot, humid weather without the flooding ahead of it. But we have some Christmas tree growers in this area that lost a lot due to this many, many years ago. And so one of our plant pathologists did some research and came up with a fungicide treatment that'll control this. And our Christmas tree growers all use it, and it saves them thousands of dollars, because if they don't use it, they lose a lot of trees to this. But as far as homeowners, these are actually in my son-in-law's yard, and the 2 trees on the right there, they look a lot better in this picture than they looked in real life. Those trees, besides the little splotches of brown areas in it, the whole trees already had a light green wilted appearance. It looked like the whole trees were going to die. But he treated those trees with that recommended fungicide treatment from our plant pathologist and saved trees. He'd have probably lost every one of those trees. There's about 10 down each side of his driveway, but he managed to save those trees. And he had to cut a lot out of that after the treatment. He just did the treatment, and then he came and pruned out the bad parts, but he saved all of those trees, and he'd probably lost at least half of them, I would say. That's just, I put that up there because a lot of times I'm showing this to groups that are actually going to be spraying these trees, and that's the treatment with copper fungicides to save these trees. A lot of our treatment, the water treatment plant over on the Bossier side of the river, and there's a couple of other facilities that use these for a screen, a visible screen, and just so you don't see the place when you drive by and that kind of thing. And they got a lot of this blight in their trees, and I wish they'd have called me because they could have treated them and saved those trees, but they just cut them down and considered they were going to lose them anyway, so they got rid of them. That's my top 10 list, and